experiences. So like those explorations are huge. Go to the position you want to explore and just play around with stuff. Play around with foot pressure, shin position, hip position, pelvis, rib cage, whatever the exercise is. It's one of the key processes within my movement model is like actually exploring movement, because especially in the gym where everything's controlled, there should be something in that allows people to paint their movement strategy.
That was Jamie Smith, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to have you here. I'm excited to have back on the show Jamie Smith, owner of Melbourne Strength Culture. Jamie has over a decade working in high-performance training. He's been mentored by some of the brightest minds in the industry, and he's heavily involved in development and education for strength coaches. In training, we have both the what, or the sets, reps, exercises, and percentages, and also the subjective, how an athlete experiences and perceives that work. Last time on the show, Jamie talked about this subjective or bottom-up approach to training, and he'll build on that in this episode by talking about layers of awareness, building awareness, encouraging movement exploration, often through the mode of isometrics. He'll talk about the key dials of the subjective experience for athletes, this and much more on the show. It was fantastic having Jamie back, and I'm excited to get started with this episode. Let's get to episode 435 here with Jamie Smith. Jamie, it is awesome to have you back on the show. Thanks for making the time work. Doing these with a guest in Australia is always interesting. So I appreciate we could get the connection today.
No dramas. Thanks for having me on. It's nice and early over here, but we're rolling. It's good.
Yeah, I love it. So I did want to ask for an update. We talked about push, pull, run last time. And, I just appreciate, I so much appreciate we could talk about function and single leg, this and that, but it really doesn't get simpler than do a bilateral thing and do a gait thing, and then compete with it. So I really appreciate that. Any updates, any personal bests on your end, or things happening in that space since we talked last?
Not on my end, but we're definitely still running it. We've got a little internal one, a smaller one that's running in about, I think it's about 2 weeks away. We had planned on creating it into this online, you could like register online and creating like a big leaderboard, which is something that we still might do. But they're still rolling. They're still good fun. The whole idea is just to get people to, like, we're big on competing. I don't know, like, especially coming from like a strength sport background, so powerlifting ultimately, but just for our community, obviously we've got the gym here, and having competition is unbelievable. Like, it just drives training harder and it pushes training. Everybody sort of gets around each other, and the community aspect elevates, and just anything that can do those sort of, like, we chatted about the BPS model pretty intense last time I was on, but just anything that can just drive that sort of subjective push for training is something that we always try to lean into. And I know from my own experience, every time I had competitions and stuff, with whether it be powerlifting or sport or whatever, everything just seemed to work better and go better, and always like challenge myself, and just trying to bleed that into what we do here at Strength Culture. So push, pull, run just ticks that box so well. Everyone loves it. It's good fun. No one takes it too serious. It's just a bit of have a run and then have a couple of beers afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, it's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, we might have, that feeds into, I don't want to jump questions too much, but I was reading some of your posts lately, which have been really excellent. And in that subjective experience, I think it was maybe the end of the hills you die on piece. And it was like short little thing, really long wall of text at the end that you had saved. And in there, I think it was talking about something like to the tune of not always taking ourselves so seriously. Like we always have, like, I have to be here, but sometimes there's almost like you lose the flow of it if you're always hung up in that world. And it just kind of makes sense. Like, to have something like, I even think about things like cross-country runners will have like a beer mile after the season's over a lot of times, where instead of doing the event, then having beer, it's run a 400, chug a beer, or no, chug a beer, run a 400, chug a beer, run a 400
Yeah, we
until you complete the mile. So
we
less
chatted
serious.
about that last time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, like I at a personal level, I have struggled with mental health stuff for the last few years. A lot of it centered around career-based things, but also just like some personal stuff outside of the gym and outside of my career. It kind of just made this like perfect storm of a very challenging period for myself. And the one thing that I've always just come back to is like my expectations of where I should be and what should be happening, and like I just have that brain that's always pushing for more, and like it doesn't matter how good things are going. Like I'm always just like void of what could be and where I should be. And I don't know, it's like a huge confirmation bias for myself, but like this objectivity of like everything. You need to be 10 kilos stronger, or even though you hit a PR, your expectation was that you'd be here, and all of a sudden you're now feeling down about yourself, or whether it's earning and finance or personal stuff, like whatever it might be. I've just got that tendency to always just desire for more objectivity, and most of it's all just made up anyway. But I don't know. The longer that I get in, I'm a dad now. That's happened since the last time we chatted. But like the further I get into just like what I call like my adult life now, like it just rings true. Like all this objectivity, all this stuff, like it doesn't really matter. It's like what you're actually feeling and how you're actually like feel about yourself, feel about your life, and I don't know. That's the shit that's actually important, and that should be the driver, and that should be the stuff that you're trying, or at least I believe that you should be trying to improve, and just searching for this objectivity in everything all the time. Just I don't know. It hasn't served me well, so I try to just help other people maybe see that, whether it be via a meme or in my mentorships or anything like that. Like I just call it the subjective experience. The subjective experience is, I think, the most important thing. Yeah. Whether you're coaching, whether you're an athlete, whether you're building your career, becoming a coach, pushing yourself, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah, that's massive. That's that topic or that question area I had saved for a little bit later, but let's dive into it right now, just because it gets my wheels turning on a lot of ways, but I think that's like the basis in some respects. Like we talked about biopsychosocial last time. It's kind of it's a big word. So it's almost like it's almost overwhelming if it's like, how do we put all this together? But it's like, well, what's the core of this really? Like it's the experience of the athlete, and people talk about like, I guess the gym, the training center being the best part of an athlete's day. Well, why is it the best part of your day? What are things that happen in here that you fundamentally enjoy doing? Is it getting a pump? That's hopefully a box that is enjoyable. Is it playing games or roughhousing? Hopefully that's something that's enjoyable. Is it exploring movements? We'll talk about that. And I think about that. I have a lot of similarities myself in that I think even about my training now. I'm 41. I'm not going to high jump 7 feet again. But yet it's like I'm never happy with where my training is at. It's like, oh, well, I'll be happy if my sprint times just get a little better. And it's not like I'm in college track anymore, or if I just jump a little higher, then that'll be good. And I've been doing a lot of reading and, just things like the Zen world, you could say. It's like the waves of the ocean, right? If you have the desire for the big, tall wave, there's a polarity. Like eventually there's going to be a down, and you have to just understand that it's more how you manage it and experience it than it is always striving, because there's always going to be a pullback if you push too hard. And I think back a lot to when I've told the story. I hate being the guy who tells the same stories over and over again, but my junior year of college, I high jumped really well. There was a lot of really good things. Great training group, biopsychosocial. I had an amazing training partner, like just a great group that I worked with. It was awesome. And the high jump bar somehow was set like if you put it so it said 1.88 meters or 6 feet 2 inches, it actually was like 5 centimeters lower. So you thought you were jumping really well. So my whole fall, I'm like, oh, I'm jumping amazing. This is awesome. And I would just cut the practice like early, and just be like, all right, that's good. I'll go off and do some triple jumping, some bounding, and then go have some dinner and whatever. And then the next year I found out that the bar was wrong. And so I really held myself to objectivity. I was like, okay, I was this point last year. I have to be this year. I will not leave the track until I jump as high as I did last year off of this many steps. And honestly, I just hit the wall, man. Like, I mean, at one practice, I was jumping 6 inches lower because it just all kind of blew up on me. I just couldn't sustain that. And that always made a big impression. So, yeah, sorry, I probably told that story way too many times, but it's just the way that I perceive, and I think about that a lot because my own training has changed a lot now, and the way I perceive the session for the person in front of me has changed a lot now. And it's like experience first. Like, and so that being said, I'm going to stop yammering on about this. I would ask you so when you have an athlete, client, whoever it is, walk in, and maybe I'm sure different based on the goals, experience, but what are some guidelines you lay down to say, okay, what are some things to make sure that their experience is the priority? Anything in the BPS, anywhere you want to go with that. I know it's a really broad question,
absolutely. But yeah, well, I think once you've been coaching for a little while, something that and I like to think of training and goal setting and like our general standard client here at the gym is very like strength focused. Like that's mainly what we do. We're called Strength Culture. Like it's always going to be centered around like the big bilateral compound lifts and all of that sort of stuff. So like our training programs per se, they're not like anything crazy and open to S&C and jumping and all of that like GPP based stuff. Like it's just not in that direction. Like we're very focal on just strength training, but within that, what I've always and just something that I always come back to is like self-awareness and like actually trying to get clients to develop self-awareness practices. And this feeds into this BPS subjective experience-based thing, but like some of that falls into like self-awareness within their movement and like not self-organization, but actually like exploring different things and exploring. And I know you got some questions related to those sort of things, but I think that the undertone of any successful pursuit in life is self-awareness. And I think Gary V coined it once is like, that's all that really matters is like how aware you are of yourself. And like, that's definitely my bias because of the BPS influence, but also just like my experience, not just in my career, but some of those personal struggles as well, is like developing self-awareness, getting people to be more aware of what they're actually doing, what they need, what they actually feel that they need. And it can't come from the coach. They have to develop it themselves. So whether it be like goal setting or setting up actual like a training plan and all of that, like a classic one, people that we face is people who may have had some time off training and they're like, yeah, I want to do 5 days a week. And you just start chatting with them and you're like, well, what's your training been like the last couple of months? Like, has it been consistent? Have you been hitting 3 days a week? And they're like, oh, not really. It's like, well, like starting to like shape some of those ideas of being like, well, let's get to where you're at and what you're doing and build that awareness of yourself and your own process, whether it be their expectations of what they want from their training. So objective goals, obviously, but also these subjective, like momentum-based things that need to be developed as well. And it just, I don't know, just the further and further that I get into my career, like this self-awareness piece just keeps coming back. If you go to like a nutritional-based thing, like we've got like a little hierarchy. I love models. I build models in my head. It's just how my brain works. I build models and frameworks and decision-making processes and all of these things. But like with nutrition as well, and like just the simple process of like, it's not a simple process, but the objective process of weight loss is very simple. This calorie controlled manner of managing intake and output and all of these sort of things. But underneath all of that objective process is a subjective awareness of hunger and emotional importance of food and family structure and family time and the weekends and your social aspects of eating and all of this sort of stuff. Like actually going through a process of just becoming a bit more self-aware of your eating habits underpins the success of any dietary change long term. In the same way for training and pushing physical pursuits, in the same way for career and pushing all of those sort of things. Like it's this huge undercurrent of just self-awareness and understanding of yourself and what is important to you, what is high value to you, how much you can actually like push yourself and not feel those burnouts and not feel those big drawbacks of sort of like overcompensation the opposite direction, and all of those sort of things. So like everything that we do is built on self-awareness. And that's why we push RPE-based training so incredibly hard, because RPE-based training is the subjective experience of training. I don't care that it's not accurate. I care that the client actually perceives what is going on when they get under a barbell, and they're in tune with how hard that was to their expectation, to previous training weeks, to what they want, and all of these sort of things. And that's the biggest thing for me, and it's the biggest thing I do with everyone I try to help, whether it be my educational staff or the people that come through the gym here, or the young coaches I help. Just developing self-awareness practices. Yeah, that's the core of it.
Yeah, and those things that, like you mentioned in business as well, like the things that can double in training that are also like, hey, this is a valuable life skill, and you start to be able to see it in multiple areas too. It's like a double win there. I was going to say with the percentage-based training, I do find it interesting, like that objective in the sense of, I remember my first internship in strength and conditioning, which made me pursue track and field. Basically, it set me on this internship was so poor. It set me on the course. I'm going to be a track coach. I don't want to do this, because it was so objective in the sense of like this person was following their program and the percentages are all written for you, and you get your workout sheet and it's like, all right, I got to do this today. And this person, I think they'd had a good workout on like incline bench or something the last week. And then whatever their weight was for the current week was just way too high. And it was like a set of 8. I don't even remember what the weight was, but clearly they only had 1 or 2 reps in them that day. And the strength coach is like, all right, it's funny because I had spotted them for the rep set before and they barely got all the reps. And I told the strength coach, I was like, I don't think this person's going to get the reps. They might have to make an adjustment or something. And the guy's like, all right, let me spot this. And he like walks over like, and then he proceeds to, upright row the 7 of the 8 reps this person does. And I think that might've been the moment I decided I wanted to do track and field, just because that was my only experience with strength and conditioning at the time. And then it's been obviously great learning all the other corners of the field and all the other ways you can go about it since then. But yeah, I was like, oh, and you think about, well, what's the perception that gives to the athlete? I mean, honestly, they probably were just confused. I would think, okay, the coach basically lifted this for me for the most of the set and I made it through it.
But not even that, like actually, I'm going to loop back to that. When people like compare, RPE based training to percentage based training, the way that I frame it is like a top down or bottoms up sort of prescription. Top down being very constraints based, very much like rigid rule sets that you work within. That just fits a percentage based training very, very well. You determine your percentages and you work towards them, and you work within the set percentages that you've sort of aligned for yourself. I would put VBT. I know you got a question that was in that little thing related to VBT. I would put VBT based training in that same sense. Like it's a very much a top down driven decision making process. Compare that with a RPE based process, which would be very bottoms up, which is very much like reactive to the situation that you're in, reactive to the individual day and all of that. And it's not this wishy-washy idea, but it's just a more fluid prescription that you can use. I think a lot of young coaches, where they go wrong or where they try to like compare these two, ultimately just weight decision, like how much weight is on the bar. I think where a lot of young coaches go wrong is that they're trying to find this optimized answer. There's got to be a set percentage that needs to be hit. There's got to be a set load that needs to be hit. There's got to be a set progression week on week or block on block that needs to be sort of ticked off. Otherwise, we're not actually going to make progress. And then again, as soon as I step back into the subjective world, it's just like, well, there is no real answer. There is no optimized weight selection, rep range, set prescription, total amount of jumps. Like any of these objective things are just ways that we as coaches have tried to create a structure that we feel confident that we're doing the right job in and moving in the right direction of. Like it just always still comes back to this sort of subjective feeling that everybody's just trying to make sure that the time commitment and the effort and the energy that's put in front and actually gone through the process of is the right way. But once you're in it for a bit, you realize, well, hang on, there's so many ways that we could do this. There's so many prescriptions. There's so many structures, models, methods, whatever you want to do, that will all work as long as the base effort is put in. And we're not done with fucking load management long term or in the short term. So I don't know, like I think a lot of those sort of things are just coaches coming back to this idea that no, this will work. It's worked in the past. Louis Simmons said these percentages will work. That means I can sit here and know that I'm confident in delivering this and this will work. But then when they get smacked in the face with this person can't handle that rep range, these loads and all of that, it throws everything in a tailspin and everyone's like, and then you get coaches with the ego that keep pushing in that direction and blame the athlete. And it's like, well, that's not the right answer. Then you get other people that their athletes start to feel down about themselves. And it's like, well, that's not the right answer. So like, I think just having a combination of these top down and bottoms up sort of processes is really important. But again, it all just comes back to the subjective experience of the coach, the athlete, the process. And yeah, like it's a huge bias of mine, but every time I hear stories and everyone's got the anecdotes of them, like it just rings true.
Yeah.
It's like we need to be a little bit more reactive to the individual. We need to be a little bit more reactive to the situation. We still have rules that we work within and constraints that we work within, but not everything is black and white. Nothing is black and white.
Yeah.
In what needs to be done. Yeah.
Yeah. I think with all that, it is funny. You look at the way that coaching education goes is it's entirely objective. You know, there's no, and that's why I feel like I would have, and I will always, any coaching education when I was young, I ate up all of it because to me it's all new, and I do think there's certainly a value to starting with some, I guess I would just say set rules and you work from there. Yeah, you need the rules, but it's like Aaron Cantor had said something about this with, he called it the inner game and the outer game, like the outer game, the game that's outside, the inner game, the things happening within yourself. Or just like the masculine and feminine. You could also, to me, it would strike me that top down is more the masculine piece and bottom up is more the feminine way. If you look at, and when I do presentations, I often have this like list. Here's all these masculine qualities. Here's all these feminine qualities. And if here's what this training looks like, this training is more feminine because X, Y, Z. But it's, Aaron had said when, just what you were saying, when it's too much objectivity, too many rules, do your movements like this, do your movement prep like this. It's all on the whistle. It's all measured and timed and X, Y, Z. Hank Kreinhoff had a great anecdote. I think it was almost 10 years ago. It was like a speed skater. It was like, I can't remember his name. It was on Hank's site. It's like, the name is KJELD, some Dutch name. And I would mispronounce it, Keld Nuis or something. And his training was air quote, it was like everything was measured, timed and objectified, basically every angle. Yeah. And then he ended up doing terrible in the trials. Like he just got a really disappointing finish and it was just not a good training. So it's like you have that, but then, so it becomes too rigid, too burnt out. You can't be fluid. But then if it's too feminine, it's just like you're just kind of like, what's even going on here? It's like those coaches who just make it up out of their ass on the day. And you don't know, everyone's like, what, where's the framework here? What's going on? So it's like, how do you put those together as per the needs of the athlete and who you are as a coach? Because I think some of us are naturally stronger in one or the other as well.
Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with moving towards more of a top-down strategy. It's just knowing that that's what you're doing so that you can be reactive in some way when needed to. But the biggest thing that I do, because I do a lot of coach education, that's my main job, and it has been for a few years now. Like I run the gym, but I don't coach that much. I manage the floor and we have 15 to 20 people come through every morning and like 30 to 40 every evening. And we help, I just manage and help people in the gym. But my biggest thing is coach education because I love that. That's what fills my cup up. And the thing that I always come back to, because when I have young coaches that come in and be like, yeah, all this like bottoms up stuff makes sense. And like, how do we actually do it in the same way that you've just said? What are the rules? What are the sort of confines, the constraints that I can work within, and how do I actually manage this thing? Programming or movement is another big one that gets highly objectified, whether it be specific joint ranges or all of this new relative coupled action that everyone's sort of arguing about. But the biggest thing is you have to have like a base set of principles that you work towards. And those principles, the way that I coach around them and educate around them is they are understood truths of what's going on. And that truth doesn't need to be from a scientific background. It could just be from an overwhelming understanding of anecdote and experience from coaches from the past and yourself or any of that. But there has to be like these set truths that we work within. And when you actually understand principles and where these principles are delivered and developed from, there's a very small amount of truths within training that it doesn't matter what the science begins to tell us is correct or wrong. They will always come back to the truths. And the biggest one is just effort, is getting an athlete to actually want to put in effort towards the goal is the biggest thing. And if you can structure training in a productive way that drives effort progressively over time, that ticks 80 to 90% of the box. If you start creating these optimized strategies and all of this, and the effort begins to drop, and you know when client effort drops, if you online coach, their check-ins become less. They give you less information. They might miss a check-in. We call that a red flag. They miss a check-in. Their effort becomes less. Their program is no longer actually completed. All of a sudden, they're filming less sets. All of a sudden, they're asking less questions. All of these things are sort of little telltales that the client is not actually engaged in the process and pushing in the process. Compare that to structuring something, and if you do it with a client and build a program together and actually ask them, what do you think needs to happen? And where do you think, or what do you think we could refine and improve for your next training block? And getting their input and meeting them where they're at and all of that. All of a sudden the buy-in increases and the confidence in the plan increases. And then again, all of these subjective sort of triggers to tell you that, all right, we're starting to move back in that direction of effort, back into that direction of actually pushing training. I think that's the most important thing, is just having these base principles that you can come back to and be open to navigating decision-making. Because a lot of people, and I don't know, like 5-6 years ago, like the evidence-based era that came along, and this huge push for everything needs a scientific PMID and everything needs these. All of a sudden, we started creating, or at least I felt it, we started creating these like highly optimized programs, but then no one wanted to do them. No one wants to do those protocols. No one wants to do these high volume, hypertrophy workouts that they're in the gym for 2.5 hours. They don't care. They want to hit a couple of sets, and when they're done, get a pump and leave. Like, that's it. Like, so like having just base principles to come back to. Effort is a huge one. Load management is a huge one. Specificity is a huge one. I like top-down, bottoms-up frameworks and using those as strategies to sort of make decisions with programming. And I think just having key principles to come back to is the most important thing. Not getting caught up in the methods, because ultimately the methods are the objectivity stuff that just, again, we do them because we feel that that's the right path to walk down, but there's no right answer. Yeah.
So within like the scope of programming, like and weightlifting, obviously compared to like coaching football or something, simple enough frame. The frame can be pretty simple. What are some things that you like to select that are kind of dials, if you will, for the client or athlete experience, like this style? What are some toggles that you have that really help to draw effort and to navigate their experience through a session or a week or what have you?
Absolutely. So it all comes back to those self-awareness processes. So the three base principles that majority of my programming decision-making are framed around is going to be specificity. And within specificity, I like the term dial. I use dial as the analogy for that. But within specificity, we have three main dials that we drive up. And all of this is, if you wanted to go through the science, it's all within dynamic correspondence, which is like it's kind of like the influence that the training process has on the actual outcome, the needle moving processes of the outcome. We have biomechanical specificity for a sport like powerlifting. Makes a lot of sense that there's going to be certain positions that we need to be very strong in, and certain joint angles and all of those sort of things. So biomechanical specificity is a dial that you can dial up and down. We have psychological specificity, so moving people towards more specific psychological input into training. For powerlifting, it makes a lot of sense. 1RMs take a very different psychological demand than hitting a set of 8, hitting a set of 10. But that would be the same for like your S&C based stuff, which is like sprint training or small-sided games or competition-driven processes and all of those sort of things that actually drive the psychological input into training and refine it over time to something that looks and mirrors what is going to be expressed on the performance testing day, whatever that might be for yourself. And then the third one would be physiological specificity. So just like energy system development and using the right pathways of all of those sort of things, fatigue management strategies, and challenging those sort of processes. So that would be the first key principle, and just dialing those dials up and down to match and mirror where we're at in the training plan. The next one would be load management. And I like just simple load management, like the understanding that training load is more than just the objective load. It's also this internal load and the internal response to training and building processes around those internal responses to training. This is where RPE-based stuff makes a lot of sense to me, and managing RPEs and educating around RPEs and being okay with RPEs not being accurate. They were never designed to be accurate. It's a subjective perception of training is really important, and developing those processes. So load management is obviously like a very simple one that falls within the objective world, but also this internal world and this subjective world and the influence of that. And then the third one would be phase potentiation as a key programming principle. And that the way that I frame phase potentiation is simply that what you're currently doing opens and closes doors for your future self. So how you structure today's training impacts tomorrow's training, and how you structure today's week impacts next week, and how you structure this block impacts next block, and what you're doing this month impacts the next month and the following month. And having an understanding of if we have a set goal and if we have something to work towards, that is constraining decision making that we need to walk through, and a process that we need to follow, and educating around that. And maybe if you're getting a lot of impact from your client and a lot of influence from your client, and working together in building structures and programs, which I'd highly recommend doing, but making sure that they're aware of, all right, well, these decisions that we make now are going to influence what we're doing in the future, and sort of like educating around that process and all of that. But within those three principles, specificity, load management, and phase potentiation, there are always opportunities to work with a client and to develop a path together. And I think that's the biggest crux, and one of the biggest things that I'm always trying to educate around is getting more input from the client, more sort of, it's a team effort. We walk this path together. Communication, open communication, and actually getting people to buy into the process. Yeah. I don't even know if I answered your question there, but they're the things I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I had a few notes.
Three principles. And within principles, you can always, every decision making comes back to them. Every decision you make has a foundation of truths that you can hold and move forward together.
Yeah. I think that's the core of it all, with the question of, asking, how do you navigate between the masculine and feminine pieces? It is, we have to have your core principles that you can always come back to. And each of those principles can have both masculine and feminine offshoots. Even like the dials, you could probably dial each of them to be a little bit more masculine in nature or a little bit more feminine in nature. Actually, one thing I did want to mention, because I have one for the specificity, load management, and phase potentiation you mentioned, but my thought with those, I guess like the dials even, is I've kind of felt that, and I'd be curious what you think about this, is that creating programming is kind of inherently more masculine if we had to look at the two, and movement is more feminine. Like how we actually move, how we actually learn and explore and refine technique. But I think what ends up, this is my opinion, but I think how we actually coach it, technique, is way more masculine. And then we get a lot of coaches who have the programming that's too feminine. They just show up on the day and like, like, what do I feel like doing today? They haven't written out like even a week or anything like that. So yeah, I'd be curious what your take is on that too. I was going to ask you that before, and then I'd love to ask you a few questions about those three dials.
Yeah, I think that is a completely accurate way to frame it, or at least it fits within how I would frame it. Is that as soon as we add rules, as soon as we add rigidity, as soon as we add constraints to the process, we are, if you wanted to use the masculine terminology, that is masculine based term, like processes. It's rules and structures that you work towards and build into the process that almost like constrain the direction that you move through, rather than the opposite, which would be more bottoms up, or if you wanted to use like the masculine feminine frame, the feminine process, which would be this sort of like exploration, this openness, this sort of like open guided exploration of both movement, programming, and all of that sort of stuff. What most people, and this is my experience as a coach, is that some people thrive within constraints-based processes. They need to know exactly what is happening, and that gives them the subjective understanding, the internal world of actually what needs to happen to move forward. I am the complete opposite in that. As soon as people place rules and rigidity in my processes, I get anxious. I'm like, I don't want to do this. What if that? And then all of a sudden I deviate from the plan and go and do my own thing. And people would experience that with certain clients. So I don't think that it's ever so much, and this is why I like individualized coaching, but I don't think it's ever so much that there's a right or wrong answer. Like, I'm going to keep coming back to that. I'm just going to keep coming back to that. If you've got the understanding of the decision-making process and the principles that underpin it, you can be fluid in that process. And when somebody needs more constraints and more rules, you can layer those in and maybe set weight selections or specific targets, or give them a bottom threshold that they have to hit, or a higher threshold that they have to hit, or whatever it might be. And then in other times with that same individual, there might be periods where they need less constraint and they need more openness and more exploration. And you're giving them more exercise selections of choice. And you're giving them maybe a volume range or an RPE range, or you're opening up that so that they can actually just sort of like free flow through the thing. So again, like, there's no right or wrong. It's an individual application of the principles is what matters. And I don't think enough young coaches get taught the principles. They get taught methods. They get taught models of application, but they never get taught the decisions that underpin why those things are successful. And then also, when things aren't being successful, how to navigate and change and still be confident that you're making the right decision for your client. The principles underpin the whole thing. Yeah. Everything.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Athletic Development Games. The new Athletic Development Games Play Boost Library is an app that is filled with engaging games to build athleticism in kids ages 4 to 10 in a fun way that builds a love of movement and movement learning. Games include those for speed, hand-eye coordination, jumping, and the essential athletic movements. The app is great for parents and also sports coaches and trainers who are looking to improve their own library of engaging games and ideas for athletes. To learn more and sign up, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app. That's athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app. Yeah, that's huge. Just because I think formal, typical training, if you're a coach, is here's the sets and reps. I say this, you do this. For both the sets, reps, and structure, as well as how it's done, which is like everything is rigid, which obviously is not going to be optimal for the majority. But like you said, there are some people who do want like more. Yeah, there definitely is. And I feel like a lot of times we'll look at those people like, oh, that person's so coachable, like, because they want all the rules. But the funny thing is a lot of times the best athletes are not like that. They are like, they can just do it. Like one of the best swimmers I ever worked with. I mean, I just worked with the strength training. I just sat in on swim practices and, listened to the coaches and tried to figure out their models. And the best one, I would watch her listen to like the consultant who was coming in and going through his process with the girls on how he viewed technique training. And she would, after that was all done, she turned to another girl and she's like, I didn't understand any of that, or I forgot all that, or something. That's just one goes and swims, So it's kind of funny. Exactly. But on the other hand, you have people who are like every single thing. Yes, like I want to learn this. And so for me, it's interesting looking back, like not to have so many personal subjective stories, but these are the easiest for me to start the process and then look at other, different client and athlete preferences based off that. But same thing that junior year for me, which I had a breakout year. I mean, it wasn't like I went from jumping 6 feet to 7 feet, but it was like I improved my high jump almost 4 inches. My triple jump 4 feet. Like I was way faster. Every marker just exploded. And this is with a training age already of about 7 years. So like, and intense about it. So this was like by far the best year I ever had, huge jumps. And it was a beautiful mix for me because I would have been most coach's nightmare in the sense that I was like you, extremely autonomous. I mean, I had grown up learning this stuff myself. And then to come in and have someone say, no, you do it like this. Like people had come up to me for high jumps saying, no, you need to drive your knee like this. You need to do this like this. And I would try and be like, that sucked. I didn't, that was way worse. Or even like training recommendations. And basically, 2 years leading up to that, it was almost too autonomous for myself because I was with like in the sports medicine program. I was just kind of doing all my stuff. I didn't really have an overarching structure, didn't really have training partners, way too much on the strength. It was just a mess. And then finally, it was a thing where I talked to the coach. He knew I was really autonomous. We had worked out a thing where, hey, if it's the high jump workout or the triple jump workout, hey, Joel, just go. He would let me just go do it, whatever I wanted. But the strength work, I did it. I just checked the boxes, did it. If it was the tempo sprints, 8x200, check the boxes, just did it. That kind of thing. And that was a great mix for me because if it was all me, I would have screwed it up. But I needed enough structure and just checking the box mentality where I'm not overthinking it. And I just like, it's just like he gave me that little outlet to be fluid. But if he would have been, all right, hey, Joel, your high jump workout, you're going to do 12 5-step approaches, then it would have been I wouldn't have expressed myself subjectively and that would have detracted from my results. So I'm always sensitive too. And that's where like that exploration dial, like that little, hey, you can explore this, or having different like almost levels of how much the athlete is allowed to put in their own work. And just the last thing I'll say with it is, I've had the opportunity to work with some really good swim coaches, Olympic swim coaches, 2 of them. And one of them, a lot of the subjectivity I saw came from like if an athlete came up to this coach and said, hey, I feel like doing this, I like this exercise or this works well with my stroke. I never saw him say no ever. He was always like, yeah, go for it. Like you and he valued, I started to realize that he knew, and this was a coach who knew the athlete's mind so well. And I started to realize like, he was and his workouts were always so intricate and so well thought of. But if an athlete said, hey, can I try this thing? He was so accommodating with that. And then the other coach had a thing where it was in the fall, the off season, the athletes got to pick like, okay, the workout set, here's the frame, here's the sets and reps and distances, but you get to pick the strokes a lot of time. A lot of time the athletes were allowed the freedom to choose their stroke. And then in the season, then the strokes were set, but then they got to pick here's like a couple workloads or something like that. So that was how autonomy was granted in that way. But we don't know, that is not taught anywhere in common education. And I just think there's so much potential there because especially once you get past newbie gains and beginner gains and all that stuff, you have to integrate those preferences in some way. You have to at least have some model. It's probably not the same for everybody, but I just think.
I think getting athlete input is huge. And in my world, like a simple thing of that is, so like a powerlifter going into peaking, maybe 2 blocks out, you ask them, all right, let's review the last, what do you think worked well? And sometimes they come out with the most random shit. They'll be like, oh, you know what? I think those 5s really helped me. Love it. We're doing 5s again. Like just the simple, like little, like mark in the ground of like that worked well. They believe that worked well for them last time. Like, that's great. We're going to go that again. We're going to do that again. Or what do you think didn't work? Or what would you like? Getting some input and getting some and being open and fluid in the coaching process to allow yourself to change those and to manage those inputs, I think is huge. Absolutely huge. And it might take an experienced coach to feel confident that they can do that. Because again, I think a lot of younger coaches that get caught up in the cycle of learning these methods and all of that think that there is a better way or the best way to do things, which there definitely is, but we don't have all the information to make that decision. We're better off, we're better off working. And I think being fluid with the client, getting them to actually have some input. And again, that stems from self-awareness of them actually understanding what's going on and why things might be working or why things didn't work well or any of those sort of things. Like I love all of those processes. They fit my confirmation of the bias of the subjective world that I think is more important. So yeah, absolutely. Same rings true with me, without a doubt.
Yeah. Would you say, so of the three dials you listed, would you say with like load management, that's like a key, is just basically how much athlete input do athletes feel they need in that process? Like some athletes, I'm sure you could probably write it and they'd be like, okay, and like feel good about it. But then other people are like, hey, no, I like this. Or I one of the curious things. Oh, so yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say with load management, I break load management to two like global understandings. The first one is the objective load, which every coach understands, which is like your volume, your intensity, your frequency, and all of those sort of objective qualities within a training program. That would be termed as the external load that is imparted on the athlete, that is delivered to the athlete, and you cross your fingers that they actually do the thing the way that you plan them to do it. But quite often what happens is the athlete will then take that program and flavor it in their own way, whether or not they modify exercises or the structure, or maybe they skip things or whatever, and building some processes around that. But then we also have the internal load, which is, I think the easiest way to think about that is, or the way that I educate around it, it's the internal response to the training process.
Yeah.
And when you actually look into load management and the definitions of what load actually is, being external and internal load, the internal load, the internal response is what drives the adaptation. And the internal response is more than simply just the physiological response to training. It is encased within the psychological world as well. And it's a psychophysiological response that delivers that adaptation and creates that adaptation. So having processes around your load management that is reactive to the psychological impact of training. And that's where you get all the confidence, your buy-in, your self-efficacy, their belief that they're on the right path, their belief in themselves that they can achieve this stuff, and being reactive to those sort of things. And that's where that psychological impact of load management actually, I think, takes control of the process and the decision making, is because it's the internal response that drives the adaptation. Everybody argues about the external load. Everybody argues about how much volume. Everybody argues about proximity to failure. Everybody argues about, in the S&C world, speeds and VBTs and all of these sort of things. However, once you actually deal with an athlete, it's the individual response to the training that actually matters, and you have to be reactive to the individual response, which is a psychological impact as well. So that's how I frame that load management conversation. Because I don't think, and this is something I do with all of my education processes. I started doing it in person, and then now in the online, because I'm heavily online now. I'm trying to get back into the in-person stuff, especially in Australia, but I want to travel. I've set some goals for myself for my education, that I want to travel and do these things. But every time I run something, I always have just like a little period in the session to try to define load. Because, and this is, I know you've seen some of my content, but like, this is part of, like, one of my key things is trying to get coaches to better understand what load actually is. And how do you at an individual define it? Because everybody knows that we are load management. It's a load management problem. You've spiked the training load. You've floored the training. Like, everyone understands these processes, but I don't think I think they just parrot it. They just like, they hear it and they're like, oh, that makes sense. I'm just going to parrot this idea. But like, what is load to you as a coach? I think understanding that and actually thinking about that is really important. And I really like that external and internal load sort of viewpoint of it.
Yeah. It almost kind of goes back in some ways to the inner game and the outer game. Like, they're both running, they're both running at the same time. And I think it was a YouTube video or something I'd watched. It still strikes out to me like 15 years later. When I was coaching track at Wilmington College, so my mid-20s, so I'm 41 now, I had these spreadsheets that counted up. It was like this little spreadsheet I came up with that counted every plyo contact, every lift, and it had like a multiplier to try to get some like form of load. And then at some point I was kind of filling these out and I'm like, I'm totally wasting my time on this, because like, I mean, yeah, like just for that reason. Well, one, yeah, it's the perception, but two, especially once you get into like sprints and plyos and lifts, like it's more clear cut than just that. There's moment arms, lever arms, the way the internal pressure happens. There's a lot of things that are more wavy in how this total complex mix actually gets in the system. And there's a few things that I had heard. I remember hearing a Dan Paff lecture where he was kind of making fun of it, because like with coaches talk like counting up jump contacts, and it's like, so you counted like a sub-maximal, easy high jump the same as a max high jump, or something like to that tune, like or like basically like it's a lot more complex than just marking down jump contacts. There's a lot more nuance behind it. But yeah, I think that was a very short. I will say too, part of it is like the way that my mind works. I like ideas. I like getting started with big ideas. But if it starts taking too much detail and it's too time consuming, I'm just like, I don't think this is worth it. I don't know. Maybe AI could figure out a better way to do that whole thing I had figured out. But at the end of the day, it's still up to how the athlete perceived it. And a big thing that I remember too that I think about a lot is I've heard a coach say like how the biggest, most gnarly stimulus of the day is also huge. Like you could do all the little stuff, but then if you had to like, I don't know, fight off a mountain lion, like, okay, that's going to be the thing your body probably adapts to, but if there's something in the workload that's like just sticks out like a sore thumb, like that kind of almost, I feel like drags everything in that direction. And then it kind of, so the way I write work training now a lot more than I used to is like, I kind of have like a nucleus of most days that's kind of like a central cluster. It's a lot of times it's a complex, like it's maybe 3 or 4 things, sometimes 2 things. But to me, it's more about that nucleus, and everything else just kind of spins around. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, that would be like in our world, that would be like the primary.
Yeah.
So it's the primary thing for the day. I think about them as exposures, but that would make complete sense. And just going back to that, like the plyo, like the objectivity of the amount of jumps you're doing and the progression of jumps, and that you need to like accommodate X amount of jumps per block, and then next block we're going to increase this percentage. Like, if anybody is interested, like in those sort of things that are listening to this, but that whole idea got sort of created as like the acute and chronic workload ratio. I don't know if you guys ever got exposed to that in America, but a lot of that acute and chronic workload ratio based stuff was trying to like determine like injury management or injury like prevention and like red flags for like doing too much work or too little work, and the accumulation of that over a training cycle or a training period. And because the initial researcher was Australian, and he did a lot of Australian-based sports, and it was like this growing thing. I think it was like 2015, 2016, this idea of acute. We can manage the objectivity of training and manage injuries and do all of this stuff, just simply looking at the total amount of work that's happening and reflecting on what we've done in the past. And then once the idea came out, it got out there and it just got shredded straight away. And everyone, like all these external people were like, what are we like? And then that's how I actually started to learn more about like training load and like what actually is training load and the outcomes of training load. Because another researcher, Franco Impalazzeri, who's just an amazing researcher and very practical, he was like, well, there's all this other stuff that determines training load, and it's all this internal stuff that everybody never thinks about and manages and talks about, which is all that subjective stuff. But like, like those ideas have been like challenged. Like it doesn't work that way. We're not machines. Like that's what I'm trying to get to. We're just not machines. It doesn't. No,
I agree. I even things like something I've come back to, or I'm trying to come back to. I always love having Dan John on the podcast. He talks a lot about like easy strength and then like kind of punch the clock type stuff. And to me, punch the clock, it's almost like a Zen. It's like a non-attachment workout. You get in, you do the work, just like you go to the job. Do the work, you get out. And you aren't like judging or overly investing and hinging on the set. And so I think about that. But I think there's also like, okay, like if it's a sport, or if it's like a basketball or a soccer or football practice, I think there's some somewhat different rules that may come into play. Like, but I mean, one of the things I really, like I mentioned with the high jump, like I'm the type of personality that will stay out on the track till I jump. Whatever I was jumping at this point last year, I have to be an inch higher, and I'm not going to leave till I do. And then I just blow myself up. And that's still, despite the fact that it was not a good system, those shades still stick with me. So with Dan's work with that, like that is so valuable for me. Just like the punch the clock, do it slow, steady, easy growth. It's probably like half of my program. The other days are just athletic fun, exploring, experiencing different ways. I guess I was going to ask you how like a slow cook, like just like a steady, or your thoughts on like the psychology of like an easy strength setup or something that's just more, hey, it's just stable. Like where does that fit into some of the parameters that you have in your models of thinking?
Yeah, so I think it would be more like training phases. So there'd be phases within like a training year for a strength athlete that you can't have too much sort of like mental attachment to the outcomes. There has to be periods like off seasons and periods where you do pull back a little bit from that like psychological sort of like override of like the outcomes and the process that's happening. And like a typical like periodization idea would be like those sort of things come more into like non-peaking phases away from competition and all of that safe exploration. We've got one woman in here who's a machine. She crushes weight. She would be like one of the highest responders to training I've ever come across. She's a mum of 3. She just competed at nationals on the weekend and broke a couple of masters records and stuff, and just crushes training. But she would be the perfect example of the type of athlete. If she started when she was younger, she would have been an incredible ceiling of training. She's 42 now and she's shredded, can crush like 30 pull-ups, crushes dips. She competes with all like the 22-year-old boys that we've got here for things like vertical jumps and like all sorts. She's a machine. But she would be the classic example of somebody that responds well to exploration in training. She has to have one of her training days is just fun. She just comes into the gym and just does whatever she wants to do. She does all these like different pull-up variations and all these like push-up variations and all of these sort of things because it just keeps her sort of attitude to training fresh and wanting to do those sort of things. Like that would just be like one extreme case where like potentially it's always in the year in some capacity because it just keeps the training process enjoyable, which again is one of those like key truths of training. You have to actually enjoy the process otherwise. But yeah, like I think like those fun, and it depends on the phase, depends on the individual, but absolutely they'd be built in some capacity when required. But that would just be a good example of somebody. There's just set periods in the program that are just open. It might be 8 sets of chest on a day. Choose your own exercises. I don't care. Hit whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Hit barbell bench if you want. Hit dumbbell press. Hit hard push-ups. Like it doesn't matter. Explore and some constraint, but also like some openness to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think more the staple that's probably been there as long as I've been in strength and conditioning type setups has been just arms, beach time. And it's like, especially the bros, the guys will just explore all the ways they can work arms or something like that. Or
arm farm.
Yeah.
Flies, tries, and flies.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even like, I just had a workout finish with a group where it's like, all right, finish with 100 flies, and do whatever. And it's just kind of fun because you start to see the ways they try to explore the different, the ways they do flies or trying to hit a certain muscle group. You see different expressions on people's faces. You start to watch their own inner game as they're going through that, which I think is always interesting. And it's stuff you would never, a more typical prescription, you probably wouldn't notice that. So it's just like, to me, it's a great place to notice like, hey, as a coach, you should be, there should be times to really observe. I mean, I think all of it is, but for your own awareness too of how the athletes choose to do some of these things.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think open play is important in some capacity. Yeah.
Yeah. You had with exploration, you've talked about it a lot. I love it. I think maybe, we don't, I think there definitely can be more talk on, well, how do we explore? I mean, it is like I just mentioned, you can do arms. Like I like to say, well, a common prescription of mine is like 5 or 10 minutes of rolling, whatever you want, go. But you had a great post on like single leg exploration. And I think it's very timely because I do think there's always, whatever the movement is, it could be a sprint, be a jump, a plyo, a lift. There's always going to be an argument. Well, you should do it this way, or you should do it that way, or it's this. And I think the exploration of the athletes, the ultimate, like on a mitigator, or I'm not sure what the word I'm searching for, but I really like the way that you had, like you were showing, like there was like some guided exploration. It sounded like too, like, you had some things that here's the thing you should find, kind of thing maybe. But yeah, I'd love it if you took me through like, hey, single leg squatting, or maybe a pressing pattern, a few patterns, and how you would maybe facilitate an exploration for an athlete and how they go through those patterns.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, it might have been a split squat, or it might have been a single leg hinge.
Yeah, it was like a single leg squat hinge shape thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, like, I do a lot of coach education, and I get a lot of coaches that come through these, especially in the current theme of the social media influence, which is heavily from Bill Hartman and his model. But people get confused about like what we're actually trying to like explore and feel in these positions and whatever. And I think they get lost in the jargon terms that come from those models from highly intelligent people that may not have washed down into the general coach or the newer coach. But one of the key things that I'm always getting coaches to understand is that when we think about like a joint position in space, or a joint motion, or a muscular action, or like a length of a muscle and the loading and the tension of that muscle, a lot of the times there's like a sensory feeling that rides with that, especially in the gym. Slower movements that are heavily active, contraction based, dominant, you can find the feeling. You can load a glute and feel a glute. You can load a hamstring and feel a hamstring. You can load a groin and feel the groin because it's slow, because it's very controlled, and all of those sort of things. And you manage the positions really well. And I think the easiest way to teach clients to do exercises is what I call exploration, which is you get them into the position that you want them to explore, and then just get them to start to shift their pelvis around, shift their rib cage around, shift their foot pressure around, are they forward or are they back, and just get them to start to paint and eventually you can add context to that. Once you position them, like one of the key things that I talk about is like learning to turn a pelvis towards the loaded leg. So if you're doing a split squat or a hinge movement, and even a single arm reaching movement, turning the rib cage or the pelvis towards that loaded side offers a lot of benefits. So getting them to actually feel when I turn a pelvis in towards that leg, and what starts to change, where's the tension response, what are you feeling? And once they feel the right thing, you can contextualize it. Alrighty, that's our glute. I want you to feel that glute and find that tension again. Now start to do some reps. And then all of a sudden they can sort of like self-organize, but within the constraint of what we're actually trying to do. It doesn't just become this wishy-washy single leg hinge. It's still like in the direction and in the constraint of what we're actually trying to create. And I use those explorations for everything. If you've got somebody that is experiencing like a very biomechanical response, anterior shoulder pain for bench press. So every time they come down, they feel this anterior shoulder. It's very common in powerlifting. Just get them with the bar, put the bar on their chest and just move. Feel their scaps, all right, well, hang on, maybe tuck the elbow, change your head position, change your rib cage position. All of a sudden, they'll find a position that's like, oh, I feel strong there, and that thing's gone. All right, let's do some reps there. Can you hold that shape? Can you feel that shape? Yeah, I can do it. And then all of a sudden, it just becomes like a better painting of how they're moving, rather than the coach coming in and just being like, your shoulder hurts because of X, Y, and Z, and you're missing this, and you're doing it. Just like, well, hang on. We don't know. And also, especially in the pain world, the biomechanical stuff is so far down the importance of what we should be thinking about and trying to navigate around. We can use it as a symptom manager, but it's not really going to give us all the answers. So like those explorations are huge. Go to the position you want to explore and just play around with stuff. Play around with foot pressure, shin position, hip position, pelvis, rib cage, whatever the exercise is. It's one of the key processes within my movement model is like actually exploring movement. Because especially in the gym where everything's controlled, there should be processes in that. There should be something in that allows people to paint their movement strategy.
Yeah, 100%. I think that that isometric too. Like the best place to learn is with where all the degrees of freedom are taken out of it, so you just shift and are aware. And it is funny to think of, like you mentioned with the shoulder pain thing. Like I've seen a lot of athletes, like overhead athletes, who they come in the gym. What's the first thing they do is they get on like a TheraBand or a little elastic band and start doing internal external rotations. And It's so, there was, in that situation, it's like, okay, your shoulder hurts, so do this. It's entirely prescription driven. I think some prescription is important for sure. It's like that top down and bottom up, right? But if literally you're entirely dependent on some prescription and you never go into your own body, your own movement patterns, poke around, find the thing that's actually hurting you and be like, oh yeah, if I just shifted that way a little bit, I think this would feel a little better. Like it's just, we don't have systems set up that encourage that. And that's why I really like you had the single leg hinge. I feel like the single leg hinge is probably, maybe that's why you post it. It's almost like the best place, because I think that's the easiest one for people to not get, where it's like, because you could easily go through a single leg hinge and not be getting glutes or mid stance or anything right. Yeah. And so, and then there's a million ways you can constrain it, and I use a lot of constraints for that because it's a as Pat Davidson would say, it's a movement that really benefits from more ground, like more points of contact.
Yeah.
But
more
then,
contact.
but then once you get, but then like from that like you said, like that isometric or just less motion, finding things, I just think is so valuable, especially for something like that. But like you said, for anything. And you had it for a squat too. Yeah. Like just basic. I think it's like a rocking back and forth.
I'm not even kidding. Yeah. I do it with everything. And I recommend coaches do it with everything. But again, where I come from is just the gym. I'm not out I don't know if it would work with like sprint mechanics and all of these sort of things, but I would imagine that the process of motor learning is the same in that you start very isolated. You start quite like a little slower, maybe on the ground and feeling certain things, and then start to build them up and add speed, add sort of less ground, less feeling, less sensation, and moving that. The motor learning process is the same for everyone. But in the gym, where everything is slow anyway, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter how fast you're moving the barbell, it's still significantly slower than any actual sport endeavor. Just stop, feel. Tell me what you're feeling. Paint it. Don't put the words in the client's mouth and tell them what they should be feeling. Get them to fumble their way through what they're feeling and where the tension is and where the support of the movement is coming from. It's huge. I can't tell you how many people that has helped in my career of just like, slow down.
Yeah.
Let's work through what we're feeling.
Yeah.
Massive. Absolutely massive.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular momentum and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Yeah, I like that's it reminds me a little bit about Tim Anderson talked about going through movements like just really slowly. Everyone can put more speed on it, more output, but then you never get the opposite, which is to slow down and actually pay attention to what you're doing. And it makes me think, I've seen some Jay Schrader workouts with like the extreme isos and extreme slows, and it's like 2.5 minute split squat lower, like that kind of thing. It's like, there's probably a lot of learning. You're going to be very aware of what's fatiguing out very quickly and, those kind of things. It's interesting with that. I would say you mentioned the sprinting too. It's like, isometrics, you can work in positions, but like you said, like making smaller pieces. That's why I've mentioned a few times, that's why I'm a big fan actually of things like low knee running, because it puts you in touch with, well, hey, what are my feet actually doing when I run? Because if I try to run high knees, I might have no idea because I'm just slapping my feet down on the ground off a high knee, but it's like, just little regressive pieces that can put you in touch. And then I really like spectrums or crescendos, where it's like you're building from slow to fast, or you're building from low knees to high knees, or whatever. Anything. You can do so many ways like that. But I find that's it's there's still a level of awareness that you can build, but I think that's a great place to help athletes to forge more connections on their own. Or we'll do like high jump, and it's like, hey, run your approach with short approach. I'll have like 3 cones, and it'll be like red, blue, and like black cones. And the first approach is short, quick steps. The second approach is medium. The third approach is long, big steps. And it's like, maybe it just becomes a little more spectrum oriented once you actually are moving in space. But the, like you mentioned, the weight room is a place you can do it for absolutely everything. I wanted to ask you too more about the squat. You had a way of just exploring the squat, rocking front to back. I thought was really cool. I think it was you, like with foot pressure.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. That all comes down to and I don't know how involved you are on social media, but there's this whole like, is the squat IR or ER like argument jargon thing that's just like this thing within coaches. And I can understand why everyone's kind of up in arms, but I'm also like, the squat is such an easy pattern. If you don't know any of the technical sort of ideas around movement, and the models around movement, the squat is so easy. You sit down and you stand up. Like that, for a client, for an athlete, that's ultimately all they have to think about is going down and up. And the biggest sort of deviation from going down and up is moving forward or backwards, which is shifting forward to the toes and starting this extension moment that comes into the system. The pelvis dumps forward, the lumbars extend, the head comes up, the rib cage drives forward, or shifting backwards, which is starting to flex and starting to look down and round out your posture and all of those sort of things. Like in a vertical based movement, that is what we need to be focusing on, is just maintaining just vertical up and down motion. And a lot of the central part of my overall movement model comes to center of mass and management of center of mass relative to the base of support, because that's what we're actually lifting against. And when we push down in the ground and we're trying to maximize the ability to push down in the ground to lift the mass vertically up in a squat, a lot of the exploration is minimizing this forward and back motion, minimizing shifting forward, minimizing shifting backwards. And again, the exploration process is starting to contextualize as you're moving up and down, where is your foot pressure? Just getting a better understanding of where is your foot pressure. Is it shifting forward? Does it start in the heels and shift forward? Does it come forward as you come out of the hole? Does it maintain even pressure? Do we maintain a balance point? Do we maintain all of these things, and contextualizing that through those exploration processes? And the exploration is the same. If they feel like they're deviating, stop there, feel it, explore forward and back, forward and back. When we find the midpoint, yeah, there we go. Let's go a little lower, come through that transition point and just explore, and then contextualizing that in some sort of cue that the client can actually remember and understand and apply. But yeah, it's the same process. Lifting weights is easy. I don't know why there's so much argument about what the best way and how to do it. Like, it's so simple. It's such a simple movement expression especially compared to all these other actual fucking
like
free-flowing
pole vaulting
all of them. All of them. Anything that's not 100% controlled with, as soon as you add actual motion, it's tenfold harder compared to just lifting weights with our feet flat on the ground the whole time. I don't know where all these arguments.
Ever since that post of yours, actually, I don't know how long ago it was, but I do my easy strength sandbag squats twice a week. And what I've been thinking about since that post was, just like, when does the weight, not like judgmentally, but more like, when does the weight go to my forefoot? When is it on my heels? What changes with the knees inside, ERI, or when it's more one or the other, but not really like, I don't know. It's just more fun to just notice it happening because it's all automatic, and
exactly.
Yeah. So it's just interesting for me. It's just more of just kind of noticing. And back in the day, though, I remember I always noticed. I did notice back in the day, everything would just jam to the forefoot, and I just a narrow stance forefoot. That was my jam back in the day.
Everyone.
Yeah, it was just to be better for high jump, but it was it's interesting now to kind of have that mind of exploring that pressure, because I think it's so oftentimes too, it's like, well, this pressure is best. This pressure is best. I've heard squeeze your big toe down. I've heard people say stay on your heels. You have the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like it's like a polarity. Here's the polarity.
I've definitely got my bias for lifting weights and vertical motion of mass. I have my bias, which is push through the entire foot for as long as you can. You want to minimize that shift forward. Every human has the tendency to go forward in space. I have narratives around why I believe that to be true, but if you've coached more than 5 people, you would see it, that as soon as things get hard and heavy, people extend. They throw their back into it. They drive forward. They shift forward. Their pelvis goes to an anterior tilt. Their lumbars extend. Like, that is the bias when things are hard, when things are heavy, when fatigue is high. most people shift in that direction. It's very rare that you'll get the person that when things get hard, they'll start to slouch and they'll start to like go the other way. And I think a lot of it is driven from the nervous system, and there's a lot of processes that we have forward projections when we're using gravity and fighting gravity. But most people, the tendency is to shift forward in the feet. So a lot of the coaching processes is to get people to shift back and find a midfoot and push down in the ground longer. Like that's definitely my bias. But again, exploration.
Yeah.
Get clients to feel it. Have some constraints that you want them to work within, but also just get them to better understand why they might be having a fault or why they might be struggling or whatever. It's massive. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's, I don't know why all these people are arguing. I don't know.
Yeah. I think exploration and just self-awareness is definitely, again, it's just like the X factor in all this, you know.
It's the undertone the whole way through.
Yeah. Just a couple more things. One, well, I do want to ask, you know, with like social media and education and how we educate ourselves, that'll be a last question. I did want to ask you, it was like hills you'll die on. You had some thoughts about stability. What do you think about stability? I guess as per the post, but how it's typically coached or instructed.
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways that I can come at this, but I think going through formal education, so obviously exercise sports science and learning anatomy from formal education, but then also doing a ton of continued education courses. A lot. I've traveled to America to do them. I did an internship in America. I've come twice to America to learn these things. Online education through a wide variety of people, weekend certificates and my own stuff, and then obviously being very applied in the coaching and now the education space of that. I think that we learn movement the wrong way around. And that stems from muscle first and the idea that a muscle contracts. And that when people learn anatomy, when they learn motion, when they learn movements and biomechanics, they learn that the sarcomeres cross bridge and there's this contraction moment of the muscle, and everything kind of, every decision, every vantage of movement that you observe comes back to this idea that muscle simply contracts to create motion. Was that going back to when you first started learning, was that how you learned it? That the muscle contracts and it pulls on the bones?
Oh yeah,
like
actin, myosin, and the three phases, or all that stuff. Yeah.
And there's a concentric contraction, but there's also this lengthening eccentric contraction, and it's like it's getting longer, but it's trying to contract and all of this sort of stuff. And everything gets reconciled back to this idea that the muscle contracts to create motion. That is what the central point of it is. And I think if you come from movement and observing movement with that understanding, you eventually start to see breakdowns, you start to see faults, you start to see deviations from that, and reconcile every motion with the idea that a muscle is pulling to create it. And then this is where you get the idea of joint stability, in that the classic one is the hip, that when we observe squatting and the knees come in, well, it's a discrepancy of the ability of certain muscles to contract to create that motion. And you start blaming certain muscles, isolated muscles, a glute med, as being weak, as being inactive, as being dysfunctional, as whatever. The adductor is too strong, the glute med is too weak, your timing is wrong, all of this sort of stuff. And we isolate and blame certain muscles for what actually is a systemic expression. And it's not until you start to realize that the human system has external forces that are impacting it. And the main one is gravity, but momentum is part of that, and mass in motion is part of that as well. That is what the system is actually doing. It's a systemic reaction to the external forces to achieve the task. And then once you understand that, all of a sudden the muscular contraction thing falls away, and you start to see movement expression as a systemic expression of dealing with external forces and managing those with an internal response to achieve the task. And this is why I hate the central point of stability, which is that a joint's position is a tug of war between muscles, where it's not. The joint's positions in space, all of them is a systemic response, a systemic reaction to what is needed to achieve the task. So when a knee's coming in on a squat, it's not a hip stability, it's not an ankle stability, it's not any of those sort of things. It's just that is the expression to achieve the task at this point. And if we don't like it, we don't blame a muscle. We teach the client how to not do that. That's all it is. And it's a motor control process of slowing things down, changing pressure, changing inputs, changing loads, changing speeds, changing tempos, whatever we need to change the expression. And that's why I think a lot of the foundational principles of learning muscle contraction as movement drives these narratives that I just see as so counterproductive and so nocivic to a lot of clients. And it stems a lot from joint stability, and that a joint's position in space is this tug of war. It's one of the main things that I try to educate people away from, this contraction-based dominant focus of muscular position and joint position in space.
Yeah,
I think we learned movement wrong.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped in a second early there. It's a very busy way of thinking about stability and tug of wars. I think it's you get really busy real quick versus
absolutely.
Yeah, versus like this.
And you just always blame you always just blame the same muscles because they're the ones that have the narratives around them. You blame a glute med. You blame an over dominance in quad dominance. Hang on. You blame a piriform. You blame a rotator cuff. Perfect example. Because the narratives just blame the same stabilizing muscles. Well, hang on. All of the muscles do some form of reactive contraction, reactive processes to manage position and all of that. The whole system is reacting. The whole system is stabilizing. Why are we narratizing and labeling a certain subgroup as individual things? And then you get to those ideas then flow on further into the science world of rehabilitation, and they try to work out, is back pain because of weak glutes? No, and it never will be. It doesn't matter how strong your glutes are for your back pain. It's not going to, there's so many factors of that. You blame all of your shoulder pain on rotator cuff strength. It's like, well, hang on. I think there's 17 muscles that control the scap. There's like 12 muscles that cross the glenohumeral joint. Why are we blaming these 4 little tiny muscles on the inside for what could be this systemic expression around the whole joint and potentially even lower in the body? Then we get to the Tensegrity-based models, the Bill Hartman-esque ideas and all of these. I just much prefer those sort of zoomed out approaches.
Yeah. It's almost like a hit to the actual problem-solving ability of the body to reduce it down to, well, this muscle's weak and that's why you're falling inwards or whatever it is. Like, it's just the thing I always like watching, even what we would call suboptimal movement or technique, is a great way to see how an athlete's problem solving with what they have. All right, well, here's what you have. Here's how you're problem solving it right now. And then there's the series of solutions, and as you said, I think too, exploration is just having an athlete explore some of those things can make a really big difference with no change in, their muscles. The amount of muscle they had here, and here is all still the same.
Then I have to think about it. And this is the really, once you stop focusing on just simply the contraction of a muscle and start to observe this systemic management strategy of forces, internal forces of what we're trying to create, but these external management of gravity and momentum and mass in motion and all of these sort of things. Once you can zoom out and see that, all of a sudden you don't even have to know what the muscles are. You don't even have to think about where it originates and inserts or any of those sort of things. You just know that, all right, to achieve this task, I need to get the leg back in this position. How can I teach the leg to get back in this position and extend into this position and hold this shape and push into the ground and all of that? You don't have to think about the deep six rotators and the adductor. Is it adductor longus, adductor magnus, or any of those? Like all the individual muscles all of a sudden just create this picture of what we're actually trying to create. And all of a sudden that anatomy becomes fun because you're not rote learning origins and insertions and all of this sort of stuff. And it's just like, well, none of that stuff actually matters anyway.
Yeah.
They're just movement expressions and they're systemic movement expressions. This is one of the big things that this G's me up. I love this. I love this.
I saved that one for the last. Yeah. I remember I learned in both high school anatomy and college kinesiology, 2 classes with all the origins and insertions. I don't think I remember.
And how many do you remember?
No, I don't think I remember any, to be honest. I mean, I could point to them on a skeleton, but the actual name of whatever it was, I mean, man, I tell you, if you give me a multiple choice of all that now, I might be able to remember a few. But
Fuel
yeah,
pop
no,
in.
it was kind of like a wasted. I think of all the other things I could have been learning instead. So
Yeah.
it's almost like a hazing. It's like a hazing rite of passage for a coach. Hey, learn all this stuff that you're not going to need
Yeah,
to know
exactly.
later.
And then make it boring so that
Yeah.
you don't actually want to go deeper into it. But then once you actually, I don't know, especially for myself, for me it was Eric Cressy.
Hmm.
Eric Cressy's blogs back in the day. I used to just read how he would talk about certain muscles and how they would coordinate and integrate with everything else going on around them, and that just like, this is mad. Like, that was my first expression of actually learning anatomy productively,
Hmm.
rather than just going through this nerve innervates this muscle and it pulls on this bone to this position, and then, yeah, I don't know. It just frustrates me. The whole idea of stability really frustrates me, because I hate narratives in the industry, because I think that they are no CBIC driven.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of them, so they create like a negative attachment to certain things and potentially influence negative outcomes to propagate. And the stability one is the biggest thing, and it is the central narrative that I think if the industry just forgot it, I think everyone would be in a better position. If we just got rid of this idea that certain muscles all of a sudden, even through the process of training. So a classic one is, and I've got this, I sometimes copy paste it, but like if you've been coaching someone for, let's say, 5 years, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, I really want to start to push my 1RMs, and they start to get stronger. And then in the process of getting stronger and producing more force, their knees start to move towards midline. Very typical thing. And all of a sudden, their knees, as they start to produce and push really hard down into the ground, the knees start to come towards midline. The knees start to come in. At that point, when the client turns around to you and says, hey, I'm a bit concerned about my knees coming in. I've never seen this before. And now that I'm starting to push stronger and push my sets, all of a sudden my knees are starting to come in. You've got a choice. You can go the no CBIC route and say, yeah, it's hip stability, it's ankle stability. Even though we've been training together for 5 years, all of a sudden your hips have become unstable, your glutes are weak, and all of this sort of stuff. Or you can go the other route and just be like, hey, since we've started pushing training a bit harder, the knees have come in a little bit. If we don't like it, we can change it. Let's slow things down and go through the motor learning process. Like, it's just, why do we need this idea of stability in there? Like, it just, I don't know. It's no CBIC.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always based on something being wrong, versus more of a centralized complex control issue, which is the art of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I don't know. It really frustrates me.
Yeah. I've certainly heard that quite a few times in my coaching career. So, well, hey, closing out, Jamie, learning these days, coaching education, I mean, heck, even athlete education, I think social media is probably I would imagine it's probably
Absolutely.
the main place people go to learn. Shortcomings of that. How do you navigate that? How do you be productive if you're trying to learn things there? Versus, I have to say this because I thought it was a cool quote. It said, if you want to learn something new, read an old book.
Absolutely.
And I was like, yes, I absolutely 100%. That made me I was like, that I think I posted that, and, I'm curious if people thought about it. But yeah, anyways, thoughts on like navigating the current learning structure, ways to learn better, and improve your craft.
Yeah, so I think the biggest, and I can understand because I do the same thing. You just observe and follow a few accounts that you like what they're talking about, and you try to paint the picture that they're on about, and you're trying to like reconcile different thoughts and what become or what appear to be contradictive ideas, and try to work out how they fit together and match these things together. It's just how we do it. We're in the social media world and the social media landscape, but ultimately what we're trying to do with that is like bite-sized pieces of information, which is always going to be difficult. One of the things that I like to do and I recommend people do, and this is why I heavily try to tell people where my information and understanding has come from, and actually like tag accounts and be like, these are the people. I view them as wells of information. And what eventually will happen within the landscape of the education and the understanding and the ideas is that people will go to a well, they'll take information, and then all of a sudden they will start to walk to a new area with that information and trickle bits and pieces and all of that. And that's ultimately what social media becomes. But if you can find who the wells of information are, and to use your quote, what are the old ideas that these things are built on and all of that, and go to those.
Yeah.
And almost like go back in time to find those people. So a classic one is, there's a lot of jargon and around the gait cycle and using the gait cycle as a model for human movement and all of that. And I think there is amazing things that come from learning how humans locomote. I think there are things that I think it's the highest expression of what the human function actually is, this bipedal center of mass gravity management locomotive process, reciprocal left and right and rotations and all of this sort of stuff. There's things within gait that are amazing. However, when you learn gait from someone like myself, you get the watered down, washed down approach that fits my requirement for gait. What I would recommend doing is if you want to learn gait, go to the gait guy, which is Gary Ward, and actually go back to the well, the objective view of it, and I think the best representation of what it actually is so that you can understand it without my narrative, without my context around it, and actually learn. So like trying to like follow the ideas back to people and don't be afraid to like jump in and think about those things. But I think, yeah, that would be the biggest thing. And that's why I always try to tag people in the accounts that I've got majority of my information from. Because what I think will end up happening is you'll see that there's probably only a handful of people, a handful of ideas, a handful of books that really have stimulated a lot of these ideas. So trying to find those things. Don't do everything through Instagram. It's too bite-sized. Don't be afraid to jump into something either. Like if you're really keen and thinking about it, maybe you do have to actually go into a process to learn it. But that would be my biggest thing, which I think is the same as your book idea. Go back and find where the idea came from.
Yeah, it's kind of like top down versus bottom up in a different way. Top down is like, or I don't know, but either or. It's like one way is whatever is flashing by on Instagram, new idea, or perceived new idea, new rearrangement of said idea. Bottom up would be like, where did this all start? You know, Gary Ward, or like I talked with like Dan John, or I was asking Vern Gambetta a little bit about like, what are your go-to books from like the 50s and 60s? Like, because it's just so cool to see, like, you think there's something new. And I think there's certainly new ways, creative iterations for things, but a lot of like the basic strength things, especially, and even honestly, like some plyometric stuff and that kind of thing.
All of it.
Tons of great stuff from the past decades. I lost my track and field Omni book recently. I was kind of saying I got to order one of those again. And so, it's
there's central ideas that will continue to run through, and then all of these new models just repurpose those ideas with slightly new terminology. That's all it is, and then the new model runs through, and people all dive on. But ultimately, the ideas are central to things that we've known to be true for a while now. A couple of interesting things, because I know a lot of people from the movement-based stuff, if you're interested in all of these new models and these new like global zoomed out things, look into Tensegrity-based models. Just Google Tensegrity human movement and start to see all of these old ideas from fucking decades ago and how they're now viewed and understood. Because I think that's the central point of the movement stuff. For programming, Scientific Principles of Strength Training from Juggernaut is a fantastic book that I would highly recommend coaches to start with. Just learn the key principles that underpin these things and then go and dive into some more specific applications and different ways to view them. Even just reading like traditional periodization books is really important. Even though the ideas are slowly being updated, going back to the understanding of where these ideas and the challenges came from is really important. Human movement, sprint mechanics, and all of that sort of stuff would be the same. There'd be central ideas that have been developed and progressed over time.
Yeah.
Go back in time. That's where you need to go. If you really want to understand it, you got to go back first.
Yeah, the periodization for sport books by Tudor Bompa, like that was the second edition.
One of them right here.
I think, it was like my first book ever on training. It spurred a lot of the stuff that breakout year of track actually, and then it just got so beat up. I think the pages are all falling out. I just threw it away, and then I accidentally bought a more updated version, so newer, May 2002. And it actually was worse. And I was asking Carlo Buzzicelli about like, hey, which of those 6 editions was the best? And I think one of the earlier ones, he said like it was like the second and fourth, or I don't know, but it's just funny how like just because things go forward, sometimes that doesn't automatically mean it's the best. A lot of times, some of those older ones are so good. So
one other thing I would say to a young coach: don't be afraid to buy a human physiology textbook. Just a straight textbook down the line, no narrative, no method, no nothing, just like learn the physiology of human. So like motor unit recruitment, muscle physiology, neurology, and all of that. Like, don't be afraid to just dive straight into the absolute depths of what our understanding without a narrative, without a method attached, without any of the, just like the physical representation of what's going on. That would be another thing that I would highlight. Yeah, just get a great textbook without a narrative attached to it, without a model that's wrapped around it, just the understanding. I think that would be something else that I would recommend if you're really interested in this stuff. Like, yeah.
Jamie, you have a mentorship, I believe, that's new coming out. Course mentorship. I believe you just posted it. Do you want to share a little bit more about that before we hop off?
Yeah, so I've got my newest iteration of it's called a movement mentorship. It's just 6 weeks of all of these movement ideas that I like to chat about. So that's actually launching next week, I think, but it will start in January. So this will be the third intake that I've run of this one, which has been a huge success. Like, it's blown my expectations of how well it's been received. So if coaches are out there and interested in sort of learning some of the things that I think are important for movement, human movement, heavily strength focused in the gym, coaching. So how do we actually progress someone from these exploration ideas into something that actually looks productive and high output and high effort training, shredding a bunch of narratives, shredding a bunch of old outdated ideas of human movement and trying to build a more productive model to move forward with. Yeah. That's the central crux of some of the stuff I'm going. I've also got a free course that's called Think Deeper that unpacks 7 of these central ideas. Load is one of them that we chatted about earlier. Stability is one of them. Motor control, the exploration, the sensory, and contextualizing that into output-based things is one of them. Muscle doesn't contract. What is muscle tension, which I think is a better way to think about muscle response and the muscle process to human movement. All of those ideas are within my free course as well, which is called Think Deeper. Yeah, I've got a few things rolling. Things are starting to pop off, which is really positive for me. It's been good.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks for waking up early as well. It's always interesting making these across the world connections work. So enjoy your first training session today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next week.